He had cameras in every room of the mansion, but that night, at 3:07 a.m., was the first time Sebastian Kane actually saw her. The kitchen was washed in a dim amber glow, the kind that softened marble into something almost human, but not quite. And beneath that quiet light, Elena Brooks stood at the sink, her hands submerged in cold water, scrubbing plates that had already been cleaned once before, her movements slow but precise, like someone who understood that perfection wasn't a choice. It was survival. Outside, the city stretched for miles beyond the glass walls, silent and glittering. But in here, there was only the steady rhythm of water, porcelain, and breath. Sebastian leaned against the doorway, unseen, his tailored shirt sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the ink along his forearm, his presence filling the room without making a sound, the way it always did. He wasn't supposed to be here. Men like him didn't wander into kitchens at this hour. But something had pulled him from his study, away from contracts and quiet deals, down the long corridor, and into this moment he couldn't yet explain. She didn't notice him. Of course she didn't. No one ever taught her to look up. In this house, Elena Brooks existed between seconds, between footsteps, between the conversations of people who never learned her name. She was efficient, invisible, and careful in ways that came from a life where mistakes cost more than pride. A small stack of plates slipped slightly in her grasp, and for a brief second, her fingers trembled, not enough to drop them, never that, but enough for someone watching closely to see the strain beneath her calm. Sebastian's gaze narrowed, not with suspicion, but with something unfamiliar, something slower. He had reviewed staff reports before. He knew her file, her hours, her salary, the fact that she never missed a shift and never asked for anything. But reports didn't mention the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was watching, or how she paused, just once, to press her palm lightly against the edge of the counter as if grounding herself before continuing. The clock on the wall ticked past 3:08 a.m. Most of the staff had gone to sleep. Hours ago, even the security team rotated shifts to avoid fatigue. But Elena was still here, still working, still pushing through a silence that seemed heavier around her than anywhere else in the house. Sebastian straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in recognition of something he hadn't expected to find, a kind of quiet endurance that didn't ask to be seen. He had built his empire on control, on knowing every variable before it could move against him. But this was something he hadn't calculated. A maid, alone in his kitchen, long after the world had gone to sleep, choosing to keep going when no one would have known if she stopped. The water shut off. The sudden silence filled the room like a held breath. Elena dried her hands slowly, carefully folding the towel as if even that small act mattered, then turned slightly, her eyes lifting just enough to scan the empty doorway. And for a split second, she almost met his gaze. But not quite. She looked past him, as if instinct had taught her that nothing important would ever stand there. Sebastian didn't move. Not yet. Not when something in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, tightened in a way that had nothing to do with power. And in that quiet, unnoticed moment, the most dangerous man in the city realized he had been watching the wrong things all along. By 6:15 a.m., the mansion had already begun to wake, but Elena Brooks had never truly gone to sleep. The sky outside shifted from deep blue to a pale gray, and the first light of morning slipped through the tall windows, stretching across polished floors that reflected a life she was never part of. She moved through the corridors quietly, carrying a tray of freshly pressed linens, her steps measured, her presence barely noticeable as staff members passed her without a second glance. In the service hallway, two housemaids whispered over coffee, their voices low but sharp, the kind that carried more judgment than sound. She stayed up again. One of them muttered, not bothering to lower her tone when Elena walked by. Trying too hard does not make you special. Elena did not respond. She never did. Her gaze remained forward, her grip steady on the tray, but there was a subtle tightening in her jaw, a quiet acknowledgement that words like those were not new. They were familiar, predictable, and easier to endure than silence. In the main dining room, preparations had already begun for the evening event, a formal gathering that would bring in investors, allies, and people who measured worth by last names and appearances. Crystal glasses lined the table, catching the morning light, and the head housekeeper stood at the center, issuing instructions with precision. "Everything must be flawless tonight," she said, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Elena. There was a brief pause, just long enough to make the attention feel intentional. "And you," she added, her voice cool. "Try not to slow anyone down." A few staff members exchanged glances, the kind that said everything without speaking. Elena nodded once, quietly, and continued setting the table, aligning each piece with exact care, her fingers steady despite the dull ache that lingered from the night before. Upstairs, Sebastian Kane stood near the window of his private study, a cup of untouched coffee resting in his hand as he watched the grounds below. From this height, everything appeared controlled, predictable, exactly as he had designed it. But his thoughts did not stay there. They returned, uninvited, to the kitchen at 3 in the morning, to the way Elena had moved through exhaustion without complaint, to the moment she nearly looked at him but did not. It unsettled him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. There had been no demand for attention, no attempt to be noticed, no performance. Just quiet persistence in a place where silence often meant invisibility. He set the cup down slowly, his reflection faint in the glass, his expression unreadable even to himself. A knock came at the door. "Come in," he said. His assistant stepped inside, tablet in hand. "The guest list has been finalized for tonight. Everything is ready for the announcement." Sebastian gave a slight nod, but his mind was elsewhere. "Make sure the staff rotations are adjusted," he added after a brief pause. "No one works past their scheduled hours." The assistant hesitated, surprised by the instruction but quick to comply. "Of course, sir." When the door closed again, the room fell back into silence. Downstairs, Elena adjusted the final place setting, stepping back to check the alignment, her posture straight despite the fatigue that pressed against her shoulders. She did not know that her name had just altered a decision in a room she would never enter, or that someone who had spent years controlling everything had just begun to notice something he could not control at all. And as the morning settled into routine, the distance between them remained exactly the same, visible, defined, and absolute. But something beneath it had shifted, quietly, without permission, and without either of them fully understanding what it meant. By late afternoon, the mansion had transformed into something almost theatrical, every surface polished to perfection, every detail curated to impress people who had spent their lives expecting to be impressed. And yet beneath that carefully constructed elegance, there was a tension that only those who worked behind the scenes could feel, a pressure that settled into the air long before the first guest arrived. Elena Brooks moved through the dining hall with quiet precision, adjusting silverware by fractions of an inch, aligning crystal glasses so they caught the light just right, her focus absolute despite the dull heaviness in her limbs that had not faded since the night before. The event was important, everyone knew that, though no one had said it directly, and importance in this house always meant one thing for people like her: there was no room for mistakes. At the far end of the room, a group of staff members gathered near the service station, their voices low but edged with curiosity. "They say he is making an announcement tonight," one whispered, glancing toward the staircase that led to the private wing. "Something about a future arrangement." Another gave a knowing look, her lips curling slightly. "Of course he is. Men like him do not stay alone for long. It is always someone with the right name, the right image." Their eyes drifted, almost instinctively, toward Elena. For a brief second before returning to their work, the unspoken comparison lingering in the air. Elena did not react. She rarely did. But her hand slowed just enough to betray that she had heard, that she understood exactly what was being implied, even if no one said it out loud. Upstairs, Sebastian Kane adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket, the mirror reflecting a man who looked exactly as the world expected him to, composed, controlled, untouchable. And yet his gaze lingered for a fraction longer than usual, as if searching for something that did not belong in that reflection. The words of his assistant echoed faintly in his mind, the confirmation of tonight's announcement, the alignment of expectations, the seamless progression of a life built on calculated decisions. It was the right move. It always had been. And yet, as he stepped into the hallway and began his descent toward the main floor, his thoughts did not follow the path that had been laid out for him. They drifted instead, uninvited, to the quiet image of a woman standing alone at a sink long after midnight, working as if the world depended on it, asking for nothing in return. In the kitchen, Elena reached for another tray, her fingers brushing against the edge before she paused, just for a second, her breath catching in a way that was almost imperceptible. The room spun slightly, the result of too little rest and too much expectation, but she steadied herself quickly, placing one hand against the counter until the moment passed. No one noticed. No one ever did. She straightened, lifted the tray, and stepped back into the corridor, her posture composed, her expression neutral, her presence as invisible as ever. In the grand hall, the first guests began to arrive, their voices filling the space with laughter and conversation, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that had never known exhaustion. Sebastian reached the bottom of the staircase just as the doors opened wider, his presence commanding attention without effort, every eye turning toward him with the kind of anticipation that came from knowing something significant was about to happen. He acknowledged them with a slight nod, his expression calm, his movements deliberate, but beneath that surface, something remained unsettled, something that had begun in the quiet hours of the night and had not yet found its place in the light of day. And somewhere in the background, moving between shadows and service doors, Elena Brooks carried a tray of glasses into a room where she did not belong, unaware that before the night was over, every line that had ever defined her place in that house was about to be questioned in a way no one would see coming. The evening unfolded with a kind of polished perfection that only existed in places where nothing was allowed to go wrong. The grand hall glowing under chandeliers that cast warm light over tailored suits and elegant gowns, conversations blending into a steady hum of influence and expectation. And at the center of it all, Sebastian Kane stood exactly where he was supposed to be, composed, attentive. Every movement measured as he greeted guests who valued power as much as they respected it. Glasses clinked softly, laughter rose and fell in controlled waves, and every eye that landed on him carried the same silent question. What would he say tonight? What direction would he set for the future that so many of them depended on? Just a few steps behind that carefully constructed world, Elena Brooks moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, adjusting placements, her presence unnoticed by those who did not need to notice, her focus fixed on each task with a precision that left no room for distraction. The tray in her hands felt heavier with each pass through the room, the strain from the past night settling deeper into her muscles, but her posture remained straight, her expression neutral, as if exhaustion was something she had long ago learned to hide. Near the center table, a woman in a pale designer dress leaned slightly toward her companion, her voice low but not low enough. "I do not understand why they keep so many staff around," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward Elena as she reached to place a glass in front of her. "It makes the place feel crowded." The companion gave a soft laugh, glancing in the same direction. "They are part of the decor," she replied, her tone light, dismissive, as if speaking about something that did not require acknowledgement. Elena's hand paused for a fraction of a second as she set the glass down, the words settling in without reaction, because reaction was not something she could afford, not here, not now. She stepped back, turning smoothly to continue her route, but as she did, her vision blurred slightly, the room shifting just enough to make her footing uncertain. She adjusted quickly, steadying the tray with practiced control, but the effort cost her more than it showed. Across the room, Sebastian's gaze moved between conversations, between alliances and expectations, but something kept pulling it back, not to the center of attention, but to the edges, to the places where movement was quiet and overlooked. He saw her then, not as part of the background, but as a person moving through it, carrying weight that no one else seemed to notice. The slight hesitation in her step, the way her fingers tightened around the tray for balance, the almost imperceptible shift in her posture as she pushed through fatigue. It was small. Most would have missed it. He did not. A guest approached him, drawing his attention with a question about the evening, about the announcement that had yet to come, but Sebastian's response came a second slower than usual, his eyes flicking once more toward the far side of the room where Elena had already moved on, her presence swallowed again by the rhythm of service. "Everything is proceeding as planned," he said, his voice steady, his tone controlled, but there was a subtle weight behind the words, as if something unspoken sat just beneath them. The guest nodded, satisfied, unaware that the certainty he expected was no longer as absolute as it had been moments before. In the reflection of the polished glass behind the bar, Sebastian caught a glimpse of himself standing among people who believed they understood him, believed they knew the path he would take, and for the first time that evening, the reflection felt incomplete, as if it was missing something essential. And somewhere behind him, moving through a room that did not see her, Elena. Brooks adjusted her grip on the tray once more, her breath steady despite the exhaustion pressing against her, unaware that the quiet strength she carried had just become impossible for one man to ignore. The music softened just enough to signal a shift in the evening, the kind of subtle transition that experienced guests recognized without needing to be told. Conversations quieting slightly as attention began to drift toward the center of the room, where Sebastian Kane now stood, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, his posture composed, his presence drawing focus without effort. And yet there was a pause in him tonight that had not been there before, a fraction of hesitation that no one else could name, but everyone could feel. Across the hall, Elena Brooks stepped into the service corridor for a brief moment, the noise of the event dimming behind the door as she set the tray down on a narrow counter, her fingers lingering on the edge as she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just an inch as if releasing a weight she had been carrying for far too long. The fluorescent light above flickered faintly, casting a cooler tone over her face, revealing the exhaustion she had hidden so carefully in the glow of the ballroom, the faint tremor in her hands returning now that no one was watching. She closed her eyes for a second, just a second, steadying herself before reaching for the tray again, because stopping was not an option, not here, not when so much depended on her continuing as if nothing was wrong. Back in the main hall, a woman stepped beside Sebastian, her presence elegant and expected, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if it belonged there, her smile practiced, confident, the kind that came from knowing exactly how she would be seen. "They are all waiting," she said softly, her voice smooth, her eyes scanning the room with quiet assurance. "You should not keep them in suspense." Sebastian nodded once, his gaze moving across the faces before him. People who had come to witness certainty, to hear a decision that aligned with everything they believed about him. But as he prepared to speak, something pulled his attention again, not to the center, but to the edges, to the small door near the back of the room that led to the service corridor. It opened briefly, and Elena stepped through, lifting the tray once more, her movements composed again, her expression returned to that careful neutrality that allowed her to exist without being noticed. For a moment, time seemed to slow, the distance between them stretching across polished floors and silent expectations. And in that space, Sebastian saw not just what she was doing, but what it cost her to keep doing it. The weight she carried was not loud, not dramatic, but it was real, and it stood in quiet contrast to everything around him that had been built on appearance rather than effort. The woman beside him followed his gaze, her expression tightening just slightly before smoothing again. "Do not let distractions interfere," she murmured, her tone light, but edged with something sharper beneath. "Tonight is important." Sebastian did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on Elena for 1 second longer than they should have, long enough for a decision to begin forming somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere that had nothing to do with strategy or expectation. He turned back to the room, the attention already waiting for him, the silence settling in anticipation of his words, but the certainty that had once defined every step of his path now felt different, as if it had been quietly challenged by something no one else in the room had even noticed. In the background, Elena moved to the far table, placing glasses with steady hands, unaware that the moment she had just passed through, the moment no one else had seen, had shifted something that could not be undone. And as Sebastian drew a breath to speak, the words he had planned no longer felt like the truth he was about to choose. The room had already fallen into that rare kind of silence that only power could command, the kind that did not need to be asked for, only expected, as every conversation faded and every pair of eyes settled on Sebastian Kane, waiting, measuring, anticipating the words that would define the night, and perhaps much more beyond it. He stood still for a moment longer than anyone. Anticipated, his gaze moving slowly across the crowd, taking in faces that had always been predictable to him, expressions he could read without effort, alliances he could calculate before they were even spoken. And yet tonight, something refused to align the way it always had. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady, controlled, exactly as they expected. "Thank you all for being here," he began, the formal cadence of the moment settling naturally into place, drawing quiet nods and attentive expressions from those closest to him. But as he spoke, his attention drifted again, not away from the room, but deeper into it, to the movement at the far edge where Elena Brooks stood beside a table, adjusting a glass that did not need adjusting. Her focus fixed on her task, as if the weight of the moment unfolding just a few feet away had nothing to do with her. The contrast struck him with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. Around him stood people who had come to witness a decision that would reinforce everything they believed about him, about power, about expectation, about the path he was supposed to follow. And there, just beyond their attention, stood someone who had asked for nothing, expected nothing, and yet carried more quiet strength than anyone else in the room. He paused, just briefly, long enough for a subtle ripple of confusion to pass through the crowd, the kind that made people lean in slightly, unsure if the silence was intentional or a mistake. The woman beside him shifted almost imperceptibly, her fingers tightening against his sleeve for a fraction of a second before relaxing again, her composure flawless but not untouched. "Sebastian," she whispered under her breath, a reminder, a prompt, a return to what had been planned. But he did not look at her. Not yet. Instead, his gaze remained fixed across the room, anchored by something that had begun hours earlier in a quiet kitchen and had not released him since. Elena reached for the tray again, her movements steady, her posture controlled, but as she turned, the edge of the tray caught slightly against the corner of the table, just enough to disrupt her balance for a second. It was small. Almost. Nothing. But it was enough. Sebastian's expression shifted, not visibly to those watching him for cues, but internally, something aligning with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. The words he had prepared no longer belonged to him. They belonged to a version of himself that no longer felt complete. The silence stretched just 1 second longer than it should have. Then another. And in that space, something changed. He took a step forward, not toward the center of attention, but slightly off it, his movement subtle but unmistakable. The room noticed. Of course it did. People like him did not move without reason. Conversations that had already quieted seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by a tension that was no longer about expectation, but about uncertainty. The woman beside him turned her head slightly, her eyes following his movement now, searching for understanding that was not given. And at the far side of the room, Elena Brooks straightened once more, unaware that the distance between her and the center of power had just begun to collapse, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability that no one in that room could stop. And for the first time that night, Sebastian Kane was no longer speaking to fulfill expectation. He was about to speak because something in him had finally chosen what mattered. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, the kind of movement that could be dismissed as a simple adjustment if one was not paying close attention. But in a room built on watching power, nothing went unnoticed for long. Sebastian Kane stepped away from the exact center of the gathering, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate calm that carried more weight than any sudden gesture ever could. And as he did, the silence in the room deepened, stretching tighter, pulling every gaze with it. His voice did not rise, but it carried, steady and clear. "There is something I need to correct," he said, the words landing differently than expected, not part of any script the room had anticipated. A ripple moved through the guests, subtle shifts in posture, exchanged glances, the quiet recalculation of a moment that no longer felt predictable. The woman beside him remained still, her expression composed, but her eyes sharpened slightly, searching for a direction that had suddenly changed without warning. Sebastian's gaze did not return to her. Instead, it moved across the room with intention, bypassing the obvious, bypassing the expected, until it settled once again on the far side where Elena Brooks stood with a tray in her hands, positioned exactly where she had always been, at the edge, just outside the circle of importance. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The distance between them remained, measured in feet but defined by something much larger, something that had existed long before this night. Then he spoke again, and this time, there was no ambiguity. Elena. The sound of her name in that space did not belong. It did not fit the pattern of the evening, and because of that, it cut through the silence with a clarity that stopped everything. Conversations that had already faded disappeared completely. The staff nearest to her froze instinctively, their movements halted mid-action, their eyes shifting toward her with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Elena herself did not move at first. Her name, spoken like that, in a room like this, by someone like him, did not register as something meant for her. Not immediately. It took a second, then another. Slowly, she turned, her gaze lifting just enough to meet his from across the room, her expression controlled, but her eyes carrying the smallest flicker of confusion. For the first time that night, she was no longer invisible. Sebastian took another step, this one more direct, closing a fraction of the space between them, his focus unwavering now, the decision fully formed, no longer something internal, but something that would soon exist in the open. The woman beside him spoke his name quietly, a question wrapped in composure, but he did not respond. Around them, the guests watched, their curiosity shifting into something sharper, something that sensed the moment was no longer unfolding according to expectation, but was becoming something else entirely. Elena remained where she was, the tray still balanced in her hands, her posture straight despite the weight of attention that now pressed against her from every direction. She did not step forward. She did not retreat. She simply stood, as she always had, steady in a way that did not ask for recognition but did not collapse under it either. And as Sebastian moved again, this time unmistakably toward her, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every calculation, every assumption, every carefully constructed expectation suspended in a silence that no one dared to break, because somewhere deep beneath that silence, they all understood that whatever happened next would not just be seen, it would be remembered. Every step Sebastian Kane took toward her seemed to echo louder than it should have, not in sound, but in consequence, each movement dismantling an expectation that had been carefully built long before this night began. The distance between them closed slowly, deliberately, the polished floor reflecting a moment that no one in the room could fully understand, yet could not look away from. Elena Brooks remained still, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray as he approached, her breathing steady but shallow, her eyes fixed on him now with a clarity that had never been required of her before. She was used to being unseen, to moving through rooms without leaving an impression, but this was different. This was exposure, not chosen, not prepared for, but undeniable. When he stopped in front of her, the silence became absolute, the kind that pressed against the walls and held every person in place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, the contrast between them was undeniable, the sharp lines of his tailored presence against the quiet endurance written into hers, the weight of power meeting something that had never asked for it, but had carried its own kind of strength all along. Sebastian's gaze did not waver. He looked at her fully, not past her, not through her, but at her, as if seeing her required a different kind of attention than anything else in that room. "How long have you been working tonight?" he asked, his voice calm, but stripped of the distance it usually held. The question itself seemed out of place, too. Simple for the moment, too direct for the setting. Elena blinked once, the words catching her off guard. "Since early this morning, sir," she answered, her voice steady despite the attention surrounding her, the habit of respect guiding every word. There was no complaint in it, no request for acknowledgement, just truth. A faint murmur rippled through the guests, confusion threading through curiosity, but Sebastian did not look away from her. "And last night?" he asked quietly. The question landed heavier. Elena hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she did not understand why it mattered. "I was working as well," she said, her tone careful, her posture unchanged. He nodded once, as if confirming something only he had been measuring. Then, without shifting his gaze, he reached up slowly, his hand moving to his own finger, where a ring rested, simple but unmistakable, a symbol that everyone in that room understood, even if they did not yet understand what he intended to do with it. The movement drew a collective breath from the crowd, the smallest intake of air that passed through the room like a wave. The woman who had stood beside him earlier took a step forward, her composure faltering for the first time, her voice low but edged with disbelief. Sebastian, but he did not stop. He removed the ring with a calm that carried more certainty than any declaration could have, holding it for just a second, as if acknowledging what it had represented, what it had been expected to represent, before lowering his hand toward Elena. She did not move. She could not. Her eyes flickered briefly to the ring, then back to his face, searching for something that would explain what was happening, something that would make sense of a moment that did not belong to her world. "You should not have to prove your worth in silence," he said, his voice quiet, but every word carried through the stillness. Then, with a steadiness that left no room for doubt, he took her hand, his touch firm but careful, and placed the ring onto her finger. The room did not react immediately. It could not. The act itself was too simple, too direct, yet it shattered something far larger than its size suggested. Elena's breath caught, her fingers trembling just slightly as the weight of the ring settled, unfamiliar, undeniable. Around them, the silence deepened into something almost tangible, every gaze fixed on the space between them, every expectation broken in a single, irreversible moment. And in that silence, Sebastian Kane did not look away, and Elena Brooks did not lower her eyes. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have something to say, but because the moment had stripped language of its usefulness, leaving only silence to carry the weight of what had just happened. The chandeliers above continued to glow with the same quiet elegance. The glasses still caught the light the same way, the room itself unchanged in every visible sense, and yet everything inside it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Sebastian Kane released her hand slowly, not pulling away in haste, not retreating from the act he had just made, but allowing the space between them to exist without breaking the connection that had just been formed in front of everyone who mattered. His gaze lifted then, not to seek approval, not to measure reaction, but to acknowledge the room as it now stood, no longer aligned with expectation, but with something far less predictable. Faces that had once been confident now held uncertainty, calculations undone mid-thought, alliances momentarily forgotten in the presence of something they could not immediately categorize. The woman who had stood beside him earlier remained where she was, her posture still composed, but her expression no longer untouched. The certainty she carried replaced by something quieter, something that did not belong in a room where she had once been assured of her place. Elena Brooks stood at the center of that silence, her hand still slightly raised, the unfamiliar weight of the ring grounding her in a moment that felt both distant and immediate all at once. She did not look down again. She did not step back. The instinct to disappear, to retreat into the edges where she had always existed, met something new within her, something steadier, something that had been there all along but had never been allowed to surface. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders straightened, and when her eyes met Sebastian's once more, there was no confusion left in them, only a quiet understanding that this moment was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a choice. Around them, the staff who had once moved without being seen now stood still, their attention fixed not on the guests, not on the event, but on her, as if seeing her for the first time in a way that could not be undone. The whispers that followed were not loud, not disruptive, but they carried a different tone now, not dismissal, not indifference, but something closer to recognition, though no one dared to name it out loud. Sebastian turned slightly, his voice returning, not louder, not sharper, but clearer than before. "Respect is not given by position," he said, his words measured, each one landing with intention. "It is revealed by how someone stands when no one is watching." The statement did not seek agreement. It did not need to. It settled into the room like truth, undeniable and complete. He did not elaborate. He did not explain further. There was nothing more to justify. The decision had already spoken for itself. Elena lowered her hand slowly, the ring catching the light for just a moment before her fingers relaxed at her side, and in that simple motion, there was no trace of the invisibility she had carried for so long. She did not bow her head. She did not step aside. She remained exactly where she was, present, seen, and unshaken. And as the silence stretched one final time before the room began to breathe again, before conversations cautiously resumed, and the world attempted to realign itself around what it had just witnessed, something deeper remained unchanged. Not the power that had filled the room before, but the understanding of it. And in that quiet aftermath, beneath the light and the lingering tension, the truth settled without resistance. That night, without raising his voice, without force or spectacle, a man who had always been obeyed had chosen instead to recognize, and a woman who had always been unseen had finally been acknowledged. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.